Welcome to Beautiful Savior Lutheran Church in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and thanks for joining us for this brief Bible dive and being here with me, Pastor Nick, for this 10 to 15 minutes when we take a deep but brief dive into a Bible story, try to bring up some precious pearls to the surface, and see how we can apply them to our daily lives. We'd love for you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, click that little bell to receive notifications, and then you can find out when we offer more things like this and other great material that our congregation produces. Today's brief Bible dive focuses on John chapter 8, verses 2 through 11. And as you may also know, these brief Bible dives prepare us for the worship for the coming weekend, the main topic that the sermon and songs and so forth and prayers are all based on. We're in a Lenten worship series right now called Sacred Wounds of Christ. We're going through the 5 ways that Jesus was wounded leading up to and right after his death. And the topic for today is Christ's wrists. You might say hands, but Christ's wrists, since the third wound, or really a set of wounds that Jesus experienced, was having nails driven into his wrists as he was nailed into the cross. And for this brief Bible dive, we'll consider a story about Jesus, how he used his hand, actually really a finger, but part of the hand, to save lives, and to save a life in particular, but more lives, and we'll get into that. And the question we'll ask throughout this brief Bible dive is this: in this story, do we hear Jesus use God's law to condemn people or to set them free for a better life? In this story, do we hear Jesus use God's law to condemn people or to set them free for a better life? Using the New Revised Standard Version, NRSV, our standard one we use with Beautiful Savior, this is the story. Early in the morning, he, meaning Jesus, came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." Now, this story begins with a bunch of religious leaders asking Jesus a question in order to trap him. They pulled in front of him this woman that they said was caught, quote, in the very act of adultery, even though they brought no witnesses with them, as they would have been required to in God's law. Such as, you can read it in Deuteronomy 17, verse 6. More than one witnesses are required for the death penalty. And Deuteronomy 19:5 repeats that same requirement. God's law could not have the death penalty if it was only one witness. But here, there are no witnesses, at least none that they're showing. And neither is there a man with whom she was apparently caught in the very act. And that's a problem too, because in Leviticus 20, verse 20, as well as Deuteronomy 22, verse 22, it requires that both the man and the woman face equal justice under the law in this situation. But again, there is no accused man present here, only the accused woman. All of these legal abnormalities make it clear from the beginning that the religious leaders were simply trying to trap Jesus, and they had no interest in his teachings and interpretations of the law, even though they refer to him as teacher with their opening question, which really sounds a bit more sarcastic than anything. So they brought this woman, and again, not an accompanying man, in front of him. They said their accusation, and then they asked Jesus, "Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" And what did Jesus say? Or more accurately, how did Jesus respond? He did not ignore them, although it's kind of easy to believe that he did from a quick surface reading. In fact, Jesus responded initially by doing two things without saying a word. First, he bent down, and then he began writing on the ground with his finger. And just as an interesting side note, this is the only place in the scriptures where we hear about Jesus writing. We know that he could read, such as in Luke 4, when he unrolled the scroll of the prophet Isaiah in the synagogue and read from it as part of a sermon that inaugurated his ministry. But even without knowing that story, with Jesus having been a rabbi, we could make an educated guess that he was literate. But here we have the only recorded story of him actually writing, and with his finger on top of it, no other, instrument to write. And yet we have no idea what he wrote. And I gotta admit, I sort of wish I knew. And it would be fun to know what he wrote, purely for curiosity's sake. But the thing about the story is, what Jesus wrote is not important here. It's important that Jesus wrote. Because the act of not verbally responding to the religious leaders' attempted trap and instead writing in the ground, it actually spoke volumes without words. This specific action was actually this ignoring people and writing was a common way in Jesus's time and in that part of the world for essentially saying, your question is pretty stupid. Now, I'm not going to dignify it with a response. It's kind of like the ancient way of somebody today in the United States holding up a hand and saying, talk to the hand. And actually, since Jesus was using a hand to do this action, it's not much of a stretch to connect those two gestures as we might think. The fact that the religious leaders responded to Jesus writing on the ground with even more questions confirms they knew what he was doing. They knew he was essentially doing the ancient version of talk to the hand. And so in response to this repeated pressing on their part, it says that Jesus straightened up. And so he straightened up and responded with one of his more famous lines, even for people with little knowledge of Jesus and his teachings. He said, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." We maybe hear it in the secular world as, let them without sin cast the first stone. And then he bent down again on the ground and continued writing. So after a pause, he straightened up again. And so to prepare for, a resumed verbal engagement, he did this. And by the way, at this point, though, it was a different engagement. Because by this point, all of the religious leaders accusing the women were gone. They left one by one, as the story tells us, beginning with the elders, meaning that they all recognized, especially the elders, that they were not without sin. Now, whether this implies the same sin that the woman was accused of committing, that's unclear. But what is clear is that they were not perfect people. And Jesus' comment, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to cast a stone at her," it brought that fact to light pretty quickly. When Jesus straightened up again for verbal engagement, this time it was with the woman. And notice that this is the first time somebody actually spoke to her in this story. Up until this point, she was simply a tool for people's attempts to overpower Jesus. They were simply just using her. Jesus instead treated her as a human being and as the child of God whom she was. And then when he asked her, where have all your accusers gone? And she said, well, they've all left. That they've taken off. Jesus granted her words of forgiveness. And yet not forgiveness simply for the sake of just being forgiving and kind. Jesus gave her words of forgiveness so that her life could start anew. He said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." In other words, your slate has been wiped clear. It's been wiped clean, but it's been wiped clean for a reason. Now start over fresh and do it immediately. Therefore, what Jesus was doing in the story was showing a new way of interpreting God's law. Rather than seeing the law as something that determined whether a person lived or died, rather than seeing the law as an instrument for punishment, Jesus was helping us to see how God's law can actually allow for forgiveness and allow for the freedom to start life over again and to do so in making better choices. So this brings us back to the question for this brief Bible dive. In this story, do we hear Jesus use God's law to condemn people or to set them free for a better life? Jesus granted the woman freedom to start over. But there's something else. Something that can often be overlooked is that he also did the same thing for the religious leaders, the ones who were condemning the woman. Not a single one of them cast a stone at her. They all went away. And what does that mean? It means that Jesus freed them as well. Jesus freed them from a certain way of thinking, whether just for that day, or maybe with some of them potentially for a lifetime. He freed them to see that God's law could be viewed and used differently and better. You know, we often think that Jesus only saved the woman's physical life in this story, but he may just have saved the spiritual lives of those religious leaders who initially wanted her dead and also wanted to trap Jesus in the process. Thanks again for joining with Beautiful Savior Lutheran Church in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and me, Pastor Nick, for this brief Bible dive. If you want to know more about our church, please go to our website, bslcmi.org, bslcmi.org. And again, we'd love for you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, select to receive notifications, and you'll find out when we post more things like this. So now go out and love God and love your neighbors.